So this is part 2 of my reading, reflection, commentary on the Platonic dialogue, The Statesman. Now, before I ended the last episode, I read 2 more pages of the dialogue. And of these 2 pages now, I'm going to go and reread, and interpret. The typical outline of this podcast, at least in the Platonic side of things, is that I'll read 2 pages, go back, reread, and as I do that, interpret. It can be kind of tedious. It takes a little while to get to good philosophical points and philosophical reflections, but it's generally worthwhile, I've found. So I'll have to admit, this dialogue is not going as fluidly as the last one did. Now, I don't say that to be dismissive or to put down this experience. It's a good challenge. Similarly to the last dialogue, the Sophist, we're following a similar trajectory in the sense that we're using this method by which we're taking terms, dividing them, separating them out into 2 different categories or classes, with the idea in mind that we're searching for a particular identity. In this case, it's the statesman. So far, we have made a few divisions on this path, but also along the way we've been discussing the very nature of classifying things, which gets to the heart of the visitor's method. We could say his sort of epistemology. We started at layer 1 or level 1 with knowledge. That was split into the practical and the theoretical for the second layer. The third was, of the theoretical, we have directive and judgment making. Of directive, we have self-directive and the retail seller. They declined exploring that farther to make a name for it, but retail seller in the sense that they gain information or gain products that have been produced elsewhere and then redistribute or resell those products or reorganize that information. So they are not the prime producers like the self-directive. Now, from the self-directive, in the context of coming into being or production, we have inanimate and we have animate. Not alive and something that is alive having spirit. Now, from animate, we have moved to collective rearing. And my contention has been one that I still find difficulty understanding exactly how the visitor is distinguishing his classes. He has gone into a particular explanation of them, which we discussed, and it makes sense. But the way in which I would think that it would be divided is incorrect compared to the way he actually does divide it. And so this is something that I need to understand better. But from collective rearing, we are beginning to expand upon this. So the visitor says, of that theoretical knowledge, which was directive, we had a part, I think, of the class concerned with rearing living creatures. One which was concerned with creatures living in herds. True? So I think we're at a critical junction in the sense that before this point, while we may have had some separate discussion to come to an understanding of how to divide a particular word or concept into 2 things that were satisfactory in terms of this distinction of class, once we reached the animate part, young Socrates took us on a detour. And I mentioned it was too shallow of a cut, so we had to go back. And my confusion is where exactly we went back to. The safest place we can go back to is the animate part, or having life. So from animate, we have the rearing of living creatures. From the rearing of living creatures, we have collective rearing, and we have non-collective rearing. Now the detour, where young Socrates mentioned humans versus animals, which we talked about in the first episode, he starts at collective rearing of living creatures. His first attempt was the humans versus animals, and that was rejected as too narrow. The restarted cut was something that we saw in an earlier dialogue, The Sophist, which was domesticated and wild. So the question is, how exactly do these fit together? Well, if we start with animate, we move to the rearing of living creatures. From the rearing of living creatures, we have collective rearing. From collective rearing, we have domesticated, which is tame, and we have wild. For the moment, I would like to go back up to a higher level, just to explain it, to define it, to think about it a little bit more. And that's at the level of directive knowledge. The directive being one of the splits from theoretical. Theoretical being one of the splits of knowledge. So of the self-directive, the road that we're now on, this is a direction, directs its own action without taking orders. So we can think about this in a number of ways. We can think about it in terms of agency. We all have a degree of this sort of self-directed sense in us, so I think there's an innate sense to it. I think we can think about this in terms of responsibility in society. There are plenty of people that have a position for which they must direct. They must take an action without receiving an order. Even in the most simple of cases, there may be a narrow window by which someone can act, but most people, I think, have this in their own professional lives. And we can also think about widening this window to have as much room for action as possible, or can be perceived, like in the case of a king. The retail seller, as I've mentioned, this is the transmitting class, the individual that takes in the information and relays it in a different way, passes it on, but he passes the information on from others. It's not like he is responsible for the production, the creation of the information, like the self-directed sort is. Then as we go down into the self-directed sort, we have the inanimate self-directive, which is navigation by tools, directing ships with instruments, for example, and the animate self-directive, and this is directing living beings. So the visitor goes on to say, well then, living creatures as a whole together had in effect already at that point been divided by the categories of domesticated and wild. For those that have a nature amenable to domestication are called tame, and those who do not are called wild. But the knowledge we are hunting had to be, and still is concerned with tame things, and must be looked for with reference to herd and animals. Let's not divide in the way we did then, looking at everything or in a hurry just in order to get quickly to statesmanship. It has already put us in the proverbial situation, that by not quietly getting on with dividing properly, we have got to our destination more slowly. So there's a couple things here. Although this is seemingly simple, I do think it's an interesting thing. First is the concept that by dividing properly, one can speed up their thought process, let's say, or the way that they are trying to find something. What comes to mind is how important, probably how important perspective is when considering matters like philosophical inquiry or thinking deeply into the nature of things. And even a step aside from that would be our regular everyday experience when we are focusing in general on things. The better the mind is at identifying the thing that it must identify and participate with, I think the better that it's going to be able to solve problems, the better to be able to execute certain tasks, to get work done, to be productive. And I think about the other side of this, in particular because of Socrates' response. He says, "Yes, visitor, and a fine situation it is." Now let's not get too far ahead. I said initially that I liked, or I found interesting, the way that the visitor said that if you divide incorrectly, then you will not get to your destination as quickly. And I like it because I think there's a strong implication there. Although it might seem straightforward, and perhaps we do this intuitively, it's nonetheless satisfying to think about. And perhaps it's even comforting to think about in a way. Because we, as these agents, these productive agents, have the capacity to strongly identify a very large set of information. And I say a very large set of information because we are limited by our capacity to perceive that which is. We have many sensory receptors, but of all of our sensory receptors, they are but a fraction of what reality really is. A step into that, I think, there is a limitation by how much of that information that actually is felt and perceived can be processed and taken into consideration by the mind. If that was the case, I don't think that we would ever lose our keys or misplace something. Or perhaps if we're asked a question about something, about where something was, even if the image flashed within our mind for a split second, a stronger system that attends to all or more types of information, or the greater volume of information, it makes relevant a greater volume of information, then we would have so much more. We would be able to identify those things, again, that object that's on the counter, if we just saw it for a split second and we were asked by the end of the day, where did I put this thing? We can say with certainty where it was because of that, the way that the mind then processes information. But we are not this way. We are not these sort of artificial intelligence systems. We are more nuanced, and we have a limited attention. And relevance is really important. The older I get, the more I understand, the more I, maybe not reluctantly come to understand, but perhaps painfully at times come to understand that the sacrifices of youth are a necessary thing, and if I only knew about them sooner, then where would I sort of be in my capacity? And all of this has to do with attention. And it's not attention to everything. I think there's a particular posture in which mind feels that it is necessary to pay attention to everything to get the largest picture of the whole, or of the thing that is desired to understand or to know. And while I think that there is great merit in continually learning and bringing in information, there's a lot to be said about the fundamentals. And again, the fundamentals, the principles of things, are a matter of attention and focus. And what we've been speaking about here is really nothing other than that. It is the honing of attention by a particular methodology and trying to discover new things, trying to think of new things, to learn things, to become wiser. For some reason, I keep coming back to this image of a sort of an existential knife that cuts its way into reality. And it revealed all of these interesting secrets, not just in terms of information that is not perceived, because it's beyond our ability to perceive it, but rather of all of the things that we can pay attention to. We can find those things that are like these beacons of light that allow us to see identity more clearly, and perhaps more importantly, identity and relation. We can see that which is from that which is not. We can see how they intermingle, and we can identify broad patterns. Now, there's been a sort of running theme that has been in my mind, and I've brought it up a few times in these episodes. And that is, there's always difficulty, and I've experienced this before, where the mind of another, of course being not your own, causes a particular type of participation and relationship. I think, regardless of what we read, there always has to be the self-direction, interestingly enough that we're talking about self-direction, but self-direction enough to take a hold of where the mind might go in a separate sort of perspective. Because it's one thing to go through this and understand how they divided things in the dialogue, and it's another to use it practically within your own mind. And I think I bring this up before I get into the next little bit because it's a comment to myself, perhaps, to take the Proverbs with us when we are trying to think about something and we're having difficulty understanding why another mind has gone down a particular path, and because of their own journey, we are not as encapsulated by the experience as we ought. So again, all of this I bring up because this is a matter of experience, and we ought to be fully within it in order to not just understand, but again, experience it. There's more to just understanding in the conceptual sense, but experiencing is another matter. Now, I like what the young Socrates has to say. He says, "Yes, visitor, and a fine situation that it is." So this sort of throws a wrench in the short term into the gears of that unilateral perspective, in the sense that of the mind that considers something in the most expedient manner necessarily arrives at their particular object quite quickly. But the mind that is open to many different detours, I think, also learns something along that path. And so when young Socrates says it's a fine situation because he feels like he is learning so much. He's made a mistake. He has been exposed to the method itself by dividing things. And he's thinking about his contribution to this experience, to this dialogue. And I have to imagine that while he may be a bit frustrated by his most recent failure, it's not a frustration that is damning. It doesn't reduce his productive want or desire, but rather he is excited by this. His frustration is turned quite quickly into something productive, into, again, that desire to want to learn. And rather than seeing any sort of difficulty as a problem, it is rather some opportunity for him to learn. And this perspective balanced against the visitor, even though young Socrates is but a student and the visitor is an established philosopher, I think it's quite a strong message that he brings. Now the visitor says in response to that, "If you say so." So I kind of like that back and forth. Now he says, let's go back and try again from the beginning to divide collective rearing. Now it appeared that we had done so, but again, this is sort of the uncertainty that we get from the sophist. Did we actually do it? Or are we taking that prior knowledge from that prior conversation in the form of domesticated or tame and wild? As we go through it in detail, the argument itself will be better able to reveal to you what you are so keen to find. Tell me this. He says, "This, I wonder, if perhaps you've heard about it from others. You certainly haven't yourself any direct acquaintance, I know, with the instances of domesticated fish rearing in the Nile and in the king's ponds." So I think for important historical context here, I want to read a couple things. This is from ChatGPT. Domesticated fish in the Nile. In Egypt, the Nile's floodplains were home to extensive fish populations, and there was a long tradition of catching, keeping, and even rearing fish in contained environments. Wealthy Egyptians and temple complexes sometimes maintained ponds for fish breeding, both for consumption and for ritual purposes. These domesticated fish were not pets in our modern sense, but they were kept in, enclosed, fed, and managed. Of course, we know that we do this today. We have fish populations that are primarily for farming purposes. Farm-raised salmon, for example, for mass consumption. The king's ponds. This likely refers to the engineered ponds and reservoirs associated with royal estates. In Egypt, Persia, and other eastern kingdoms, where valuable or ornamental fish were cultivated. Greek visitors to the Persian court, for example, remarked on royal pleasure gardens, with artificial lakes stocked with fish. These ponds were a mark of luxury and centralized power, because they required resources, control of water supply, and labor to maintain. Now, ornamental fountains. By Plato's day, Greek elites, especially those who had traveled, would have heard or seen ornamental waterworks, whether in private estates or public spaces. These sometimes included basins with fish, both for display and as a symbol of abundance. In Athens itself, such displays were rare, but in the East, they were more common. And we're given another image by the visitor, which I think is important in the historical context, or in the historical context, and in the experience of another civilization that had lived. And again, examples of goose rearing and crane rearing, even if you haven't traveled over the plains of Thessaly, you've certainly heard about these and believe that they exist. And so the visitor continues to take us somewhere. Where exactly, we don't know. Again, the reflection pops into mind, that we have a particular mind carving its way into the thought space, into that reality space. We have another young mind that had a thought of a way to go earlier, corrected to a degree, but not corrected past his due course, not corrected past his agency. He says, "It's for this purpose that I've asked you all of this. Of the rearing of herd animals, some has to do with creatures living in water, some also with creatures that live on dry land." So here we have another division. A potential division. Creatures on dry land and living in water. Do you agree, then, that we must split the expert knowledge of collective rearing into two in this way, allocating one of its two parts to each of these, calling one aquatic rearing and the other dry land rearing. And we certainly shan't ask, in this case, to which of the two sorts of expertise kingship belongs. It's quite clear to anyone. If the king was involved in aquatic rearing, he would be raising sea people, but of course he rears dry land people. Everybody would divide the dry land rearing sort of herding by separating it by reference to the winged and what goes on foot. This is how we divide it. He says, well then, mustn't we look for statesmanship in relation to what goes on foot? Or don't you think that practically even the simplest of minds supposes so? I'm going to pause here for a moment, reflect on the nature of the division. Everybody would divide dry land rearing into a sort of herd rearing. So we have seen two divisions so far. One has been from collective rearing down to dry land rearing and water or aquatic rearing. And we would have the division of dry land as winged and what goes on foot. So if we are to be examining this in terms of slices of reality, if we will, when we think about collective rearing, a lot of things might come to mind. But we have to be able to go somewhere, and we have to have a solid footing to be able to go somewhere. And if we are stuck in that minded space that causes us to be drowned in the plurality of things that is collective rearing, then we would find ourselves in some trouble. So we have to do something in particular. What exactly is that? Well, we have to think about it. Two things. Let's just focus on two things. But maybe more than just that, we have to think about dividing something, opening it up on the inside to see what it reveals. Another way we can think about it is a type of light that is shown on it such that it exposes some type of information to us. Now, what exactly is the light that shines forth from splitting animate into the rearing of living creatures to the collective rearing to the domesticated or tame and wild, and from domesticated we split into aquatic rearing and dry land rearing. In some sense, I don't want to overcomplicate the issue, but at the same time I don't want to miss anything either. So this is why I go off on these tangents rather tediously. On the road to the Statesman, much like in the Sophist, when we divided things to the Sophist, eventually when we got to a certain point, there was a serious conversation that had to be had about fundamental principles, about that which is and that which is not. And we came to a really strong understanding of the interplay of these things, which fed directly into our epistemology, our understanding of knowledge, understanding of things, how they relate to one another. And it seems that it was sort of one or two bricks in this much bigger structure that we are involved in building. So we agree that the king, or the statesman, perhaps, is likely to be found on the domesticated side of rearing, or the tame side of rearing, and in the landed, or the dry land, rearing sort. And he divides this farther by separating it into winged and that which goes on foot. At this point he says that we must look for statesmanship in relation to what goes on foot. The expertise to do with the management of creatures that go on foot, we must show it being cut into two, like an even number. So before we go on to that next little bit, let's experiment about what we can manage here. Now again, we can fall into what young Socrates wanted to say. We could say that we could split it into human and animal, but then again we have an example of a whole being sliced too thin that would avoid a good division. A good division leads us closer to our object, which is the Statesman. Now the visitor presents us with this crossroads. He says, "Now it seems that there are two routes to be seen stretching out in the direction of the part towards our argument has hurried. One of them quicker, dividing the small part off against the large one, while the other more closely observes the principle we were talking about earlier, that one should cut in the middle as much as possible, but is longer. We're going to go down whichever of these two routes that you like." Now it's interesting that he brings this up, because just a moment ago there is this hesitation in what young Socrates had to say about being joyous that they have taken sort of a long tangential path, and they're exploring all of these avenues, even if there are mistakes involved. Now, I will comment that I don't think that the visitor was particularly divorced with this philosophy, but all the same, he is keeping in mind that philosophy of practicality, perhaps of expedience to a degree, such that when we split something down in the middle, we more readily have that slice. But now, he's indicating that if we slice it down the middle, it might take a little bit longer to get there. So there's this interplay, the tension between these two ideas. And I think it really depends on the context. It depends where we are, what we're dealing with, the road that we have currently gone down. So I go back to what I was saying previously about dividing the dry land sort, that which goes on foot, perhaps I should say, of the sort that goes on dry land and of the sort that goes on foot. How are we to divide these? If I start with experience of somebody that is one of these things, then surely, by being, I ought to have some idea of how to divide these things. So in order to go about this, I suppose that we can think about a number of different qualities, attributes, characteristics. Certainly, as we have gone down in layers and in levels, we have less of the whole that was to divide. So perhaps, as we come down these levels, come down the rungs of the ladder, what young Socrates had to say earlier about the division between the human being and the animal becomes a little bit more possible. But still, I don't think we're at that point. The other thing I want to keep in mind is that the visitor pointed out even and odd. So we have these two tasks in front of us. Recognizing of the whole, an analogy to numbers, even and odd, splitting it in such a way, and then this sort of implicit experiential domain in which we might be able to have to pull some insight out of. So of being a dry land animal that walks on foot, I can say that I depend on certain constancies of reality. That my nature, my physical nature, is constituted in a particular manner. It has adapted to a particular set of circumstances that are different from those circumstances that occur from those that fly and from those that occupy the waters. However, there are some similarities between all of us. There necessarily has to be. And in all things, I think we can say that there is relation. So we ought not to get lost in the relation among things when trying to divide something most prudently. But I suppose that's the exact task. What I mean to say is that we ought not to say that it is because of relation that we cannot divide, and that because something is related to something else, then we should move on to a concept for which we can find no relation. And in this way, I would say that that's impossible, because all things are related in some way. It cannot participate in that which is without having some relation to other things. So I want to go to number just for a moment, and then we'll bounce back to what we were saying earlier. So if I pull a few chess pieces forward, I'll pull my pawns forward, and maybe a few others. What I see in front of me are 6 pieces, 6 numbers. Now the question in front of me is, how do we divide this? Well, the question of dividing, we've already said from an earlier standpoint, is that we divide for a particular purpose. We're going somewhere. We're going towards the Statesman. So we have to keep this in mind. But we're also dividing based on principle. And this principle is less dependent upon the purpose or the meaning of where we are going, and more dependent upon the structure, the form of that which we are dividing. Now it can have direction. Whatever we split, we can go in the direction that is more closely related to the Statesman. But when we think about number, we think about identity. There's something inherent to that thing. Something inherent about that which goes on foot and lives on dry land that we have to keep in mind. And so when we think about number, just as you mentioned before about 10,000, if we cleave off the 10,000, what we are left with is a vast array of different identities. Now, in the way that the visitor explains just now about this road being potentially long, there's sort of a gamble that I see. We can cut off an identity, a small part of the whole, and we can have a super concentrated identity. We can get it right, and we can follow it to a particular conclusion. Maybe we can find something that we did not understand prior about the Statesman. But we ignored the broader identity. And I have to wonder about the relationship of identifying the smaller identities at the expense of the larger. Moreover, when he says that we are dividing something into its most principled halves, let's say, then what we have is maybe something closer to the true nature of division of an identity. Where in the human being, we say often that there is a right brain and a left brain. There are qualities and characteristics of each of these that participate together. But it's quite a fundamental piece of that puzzle, of that whole, much like even and odd is. So of these 6 pieces, the chess pieces that I have in front of me, I could split my hand down the middle and I could take 3 and 3. But if I do that, what is to say that this is the most appropriate division? Of number in general, I cannot do this. because the numbers are infinite. If we have a finite set, then it raises the potential for this possibility. And it's not in all cases that we come to a situation in which all things that we choose to divide are infinite in number. Most of the things that we've talked about so far have not been infinite in number. There are finite number of animals to collectively rear, or a finite number of domesticated animals, a finite number of wild animals. And so we can certainly divide something with finite numbers. And just because number has that quality of infinity to it, it ought not to dissuade us from this particular example. So when we go back to this now, I can divide it into two, but still the question remains. Is my division from one to the other completely accurate? Is it the best, logically? Well, much like number, because we could not divide the number of them, we took more of an abstract concept, like even and odd, to use to divide them. Here, we can also use sort of an abstract concept to divide them. I have 4 pawns, 1 queen, and 1 king. Now, I can take the queen and the king, and I could take a pawn and have 3 pawns on the other division. But this doesn't help us very much. If we are to say that each of these pieces has a particular purpose, and if we say that if we stick with the analogy of the sophist, that the queen is the representation of that which is not, and the king is the representation of that which is, and we ignore for a moment the responsibilities of the pawns, which were difference, we can cut it and say that there are 2 pawns that belong to the queen and 2 pawns that belong to the king. The pawns have their own responsibilities, dependent on the nature of the queen and the king. This is a good division, I would say. Now, if we think about dry land animals that go on foot, much like we did with our king and queen, we can assign identities. Now, what does this mean? Before we did that, before we performed the division, we were sort of in a meaningless realm. We did not really identify qualities. We identified a super basic attribute, which is the pure number of pieces, which was 6. Dividing them 3 into 3 gives us 2 equal halves, but not in every respect. And in fact, it does not give us equal halves in the most important respect, which is in terms of value and in terms of meaning. Because if we combined the queen and the king together, we'd be missing something extremely important about 2 identities that are separate, that need to be realized as different. So, expanding this analogy a little bit, using the queen and her pawns to assist us here in the spirit of her ability. She is the master of that which is not, and she is the identifier of identity. She understands difference and separation. She understands how to divide the singular into the multiple. But she does this given her relationship to that which is, which of course is the playground for all things to be divided, to be understood. But that which is has a unifying element to it, for it is something. That which is not is something, of course, but in relation to that which is. So when I asked the Queen, "What do you see?" I see her pawns of difference being spread out upon the landscape of this particular question of how to divide that which goes on foot. And I see all of these little divisions. Many of them separate out things, separate out identities, that is, of things that go on foot. So, of course, I would be one of them. It would separate that from my cat. My cat would be separated from my other cat. I would be separated from my friends. I would be separated from my coworkers, and so forth and so on. We can see emerging how individual perspective takes root in this, and how many different identities, the sheer quantity of them, exist. So we're kind of faced with two dilemmas. One is, just like we faced with the pieces, we can either divide them completely in half and then risk having a bunch of important identities on one side that we really have no idea about versus some superficial identities, maybe a more shallow cut, whatever the case might be, with a bunch of identities on the other side. So necessarily the most important part then is there are a bunch of these outlined identities that we know to exist, but we don't really understand what fills them in or what connects them. So I think we can say two things now, or three things. That in the first instance, as the Queen looks out upon this footed animal, or footed, that which goes on dry land, footed animal landscape, there are a bunch of identities that have come through. Right now they are just sort of outlines, vague shapes, no real identifying features to them. The second is the idea that we know that things are interconnected. We know that each one of these vague shapes have some relationship to another. We know that they're all related at the very least by the heading that they are united by, which is herd creatures, collective reared creatures that go on dry land, that go on foot. And this is more of our king's territory, giving the unification. Now, as the Queen attempts to divide this into two acceptable principled divisions, the king is going to come in and provide us with an identity that holds both of those things together. And so they have to be quite strong and stable identities to do so. Now this is where I have to defer to the visitor. I can continue this line of thinking and come up with my own division, but that's not going to really do us much following their trajectory towards the statesman. So he ends up dividing of tame things that live in herds. We find those that go on foot naturally divided into those that come into being without horns and some with horns. He says, well then, divide the management of creatures that go on foot by assigning it to each of these two parts, using a descriptive phrase for the results of the division. For if you want to give them names, it will be more complicated than necessary. So this is where we find ourselves on the next page. And so I'll have to read the next page, 2 pages of material. But here, a comment, a continual running theme, that at least in my mind, the way that the visitor goes about his divisions, surely it is principled, but it leaves me with an understanding, an awareness that there are so many different paths that we can choose. Again, I think about a sphere that can be divided at any point along its circumference. And if we take one static image, if we're a few degrees off of one cut that's relatively in the middle, it doesn't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things, but we might start with two completely different terms. The other thing that comes to mind is it also doesn't necessarily even have to be something that is, this is going to be important here to establish an appropriate connection, something that is related to something in a particular manner. The particulars would include a sense of closeness in relation, but it's a particular type of relation, a relation that is important to the subject, the person that is thinking, for example. So I think that's sort of why we ran into the issue with young Socrates. He was so desirous of getting to himself, the human being. But while it is an object of ours to find the statesman, who is a human being, and he rules over human beings, we cannot let the selfish desires and the heart distract us from a measured and managed emotional opening relative to the emotional floodgates being open and then sort of being left to the mercy of the emotional state, which can be particularly damaging to reason. So I'd like to read these 2 pages now. Now, young Socrates says, "How then should it be put?" The visitor, like this: by saying that when knowledge that has to do with the management of creatures that goes by foot is divided into 2, one part is allocated to the horned part of the herd, and the other to the hornless part. Let it be put like that. In any case, it's sufficiently clear, says young Socrates. Now as for the next step, it's perfectly obvious to us that the king tends a sort of docked herd of hornless creatures. How couldn't it be clear? So by breaking this up, let's try to assign what falls to him. Yes, certainly. Well, do you want to divide it by split-hooved and so-called single-hooved, or by interbreeding and non-interbreeding? I think you grasp the point. What's that? That horses and donkeys are naturally such as to breed from one another. Yes. Whereas what is still left of the smooth-headed herd of tame creatures is unmixed in breeding, one with another. Quite. So, does the statesman, then, seem to take care of an interbreeding or of some non-interbreeding sort? Clearly, of the non-mixing sort. This, then it seems, we must separate into 2, as we divided in the previous cases. Indeed, we must, says young Socrates. The visitor: now those creatures that are tame and live in herds have pretty well all now been cut into their pieces, except for 2 classes. For it is not worth our while to count the class of dogs as among creatures living in herds. No, indeed. But what are we to use to divide the two classes? Something that is absolutely appropriate for Theaetetus and you to use in your distributions, since it's geometry the two of you engage in. What is it? The visitor says, the diagonal. One could say, and then again the diagonal of the diagonal. What do you mean? The nature which the family or class of us humans possesses surely isn't endowed for the purpose of going from place to place any differently from the diagonal that has the power of 2 feet. Now I want to read a footnote here. In Greek mathematical parlance, having the power of 2 feet is the way of expressing the length of the diagonal of 1 foot square, in modern terms, square root of 2. The expression reflects that a square formed on this line will have an area of 2 square feet. The diagonal of this square will then have the power of 4 feet. The power of the diagonal of our power in the visitor's next remark. All this is for the sake of the pun on power and feet. We humans are enabled to move by having 2 feet, while the members of the remaining class, from which we are being distinguished, pigs, have 4. On the mathematical use of power, there's a reference. See Theaetetus. That brings back some memories. It's interesting how things can slip away over time, both in terms of the physical, in the sense of the body, but also in terms of cognition, understanding, knowing. But in any case, young Socrates says, no. The visitor, and what's more, the nature of the remaining class has in its turn the power of the diagonal of our power, if indeed it was endowed with 2 times 2 feet. Of course it is, and I actually almost understand what you want to show. And there's more. Do we see, Socrates, that there's something else resulting in our divisions that would itself have done well as a comic turn? What's that? That our human class has shared the field and run together with the noblest and also most easygoing class of existing things? I see it turning out very oddly indeed. Well, isn't it reasonable to expect the slowest, or sowest, to come in last? Yes, I can agree with that. And don't we notice that the king looks even more ridiculous when he continues to run along with his herd and has traversed convergent paths with the man who for his part is best trained for all the easygoing life? Absolutely right. Yes, Socrates. And what we said before in our inquiry about the sophist is now plainer. What's that? That such a method of argument as ours is not more concerned with what is more dignified than with what is not, and neither does it at all despise the smaller more than the greater, but always reaches the truest conclusion by itself. So that concludes those 2 pages. Interestingly, the end of this dialogue is kind of it shares the reflection that we had earlier. So let's go through these 2 pages and see what we can sort out, especially that bit about the mathematical comparison. I'd like to understand that a little bit better. So today happens to be a new day, and I wanted to begin this segment in a way that I find a bit of longing for. You know, it's been maybe a month or 2 since we've left the Proverbs, and the religious domain and the philosophical domain are interrelated. There are times when I feel a little bit more sentimental, perhaps even melancholic than others, and today is one of those, I think, sentimental days. And I wanted to start this. Usually I keep my prayers in private, but usually before each one of these, I begin with a prayer, and I wanted to maybe verbalize it now. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. Lord, today is a Sunday. It is a Sunday, as you know, that of last, I had the desire of improving upon my failures. And that absent attitude, the laziness of mind, it never really surprises me it never ceases to surprise me, I should say. By which angle fatigue and self-doubt can penetrate my defenses. But today I'm thankful that while my productivity was not perfect, I'm thankful that I was able to get a lot done. And yesterday was not terrible either. All of this I'm thankful for. Of the prayer earlier, I had mentioned the situations for which my heart had failed me, and for that I want to bring again to our attention. And in relation to this dialogue and the knowledge that I wish to gain or wish to experience, I ask that my heart can be apportioned to your graces, to your goodness, that I may not fall into this absence of mind as I'm thinking about a concept and then wander off somewhere else, spending the productive hours in some way intermeshed in some selfish excuse that since I sit here with the book open and the reading light on and the microphone in front of me that I'm doing something. But in fact, that's not always the case. Sometimes I can find myself here and my mind wanders and it's not all that productive at all. So in the spirit of discipline, I ask that you be with me as I go through this. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So, let's see. The first thing that I want to talk about, the visitor says on the previous page, the ending on the previous page, he says, "Well then, divide the management of creatures that go on foot by assigning it to each of these two parts, using a descriptive phrase for the results of the division. For if you want to give them names, it will be more complicated than necessary." So the first couple times I read this, and I didn't really understand what he was talking about. Now the aspects of the divisions, certainly I understand. This is what we've been doing all along. Descriptive phrases. The naming was the thing that confused me. I asked myself the question, why would it be more complicated than necessary? What is the difference between the name and a descriptive phrase? And as best as I can imagine, I think a name is something a little bit more concrete than a descriptive phrase. A descriptive phrase gets us in the door. It allows us to identify without needing to understand every bit of information. Because as we've already experienced, when we go down these roads, sometimes we find an avenue that we have defined, and then the separate division, the visitor will say, well, maybe we can come back to that, or somebody else can come back to this later and name it, or properly define it, whatever. And that's because that information is not all that relevant to where we need to go. We've already found the path that we need to walk down. to get to the Statesman, so we go there. And so by naming something, again, it is to give it a concreteness that may not necessarily be necessary. Visitor says, when the knowledge that has to do with the management of creatures that go by foot is divided into two, one part is allocated to the horn part of the herd, and the other to the hornless part. Interesting division. I've come here before to his divisions, and I've been a bit puzzled by why he goes there. But nonetheless, as I've said earlier, we have to start somewhere. And regardless of direct relevance, it would seem that in the spirit of that which is, within the power of oneness, and that thread that spreads through all things and describes their relatedness and intelligibility, we may, even by a division into an area that seems so strange as horned and non-horned animals, that we may still find the Statesman. The visitor says, it's perfectly obvious to us that the king tends a sort of docked herd of hornless creatures. Now this docked herd is something that I had to explore. So the Greek word behind docked, the word is translated as docked, is derived from the Greek kolobos, which literally means docked, cut short, mutilated, or deprived of something. It was often used for animals whose horns had been cut off, so right in line with what we were talking about. Or more broadly, for anything clipped or curtailed. So there's a certain symbolism, I think, that comes with horns. It's not insignificant. That the horn is this image of a wild beast. And the human beings are the ones that have shed this apparatus. Making humans distinct from the dangerous horned animals. So we are cut back in our barbarity, perhaps, relative to some of the other species. That may be a stretch, I don't know. So by breaking this up, let's try to assign what falls to him. Do you want to divide it by the split-hooved and the so-called single-hooved, or by interbreeding and non-interbreeding? I think you grasp the point. And he clarifies, he says, the point being that horses and donkeys are naturally such as to breed from one another. And these are the single-hooved and of the interbreeding type. What is still left of the smooth-headed herd of tame creatures is unmixed in breeding, one with another. So, does the Statesman then seem to take care of the interbreeding, or of some non-interbreeding sort? Of course, our answer is the non-mixing sort. Human beings do not have the capacity, even back then, for that interbreeding. The Neanderthals were gone by then. The last interbreeding events between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals likely was 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, per ChatGPT. Now, of the non-mixing sort, we are going to separate these into two. He says, now those creatures that are tame and live in herds have plenty, well, all now have been cut into their pieces, except for two classes. For it is not worth our while to count the class of dogs as among creatures living in herds. So at this point we arrive to something that we can spend some time reflecting on. Because at the point where we have reached non-interbreeding, humans with humans only, we are going to use a new tool in order to perform this division. Young Socrates says, but what are we to use to divide the two classes? The visitor indicates that it's geometry, and specifically the diagonal. And the diagonal of the diagonal. The nature which the family or class of us humans possesses surely isn't endowed for the purpose of going from place to place any differently from the diagonal that has the power of 2 feet. So here we have to do some work to understand this. So what I think that he's saying here, the footnote here by the author or the translator helps a lot, but what I think he's saying here is that if we conceptualize a 1 foot square, we draw a line down, we separate that into 2 separate triangles, the length of which along the middle we don't know what it is, but by our elementary math skills we understand that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. What we end up with is the result of the square root of 2 being the hypotenuse, or that c squared. And if we think about it in terms of the class or of our experience, of our nature, and we think about things that need to be divided, perhaps there is the implication that the human being may take this road by his understanding. But it is more than just that. And again, this might be looking a little bit too far into it, but there is some philosophical consistency, I think, here. In the first instance, when we think about the two-footedness of man, we have an irrational identity, something that's not purely animal, not purely divine, but something odd, something in between, the diagonal. Whereas the four-footedness is straightforward, natural, following the squaring logic without deviation. Also, when we think about the visitor in his complaints against young Socrates earlier about dividing too thinly, we can think about the same now. Is this not a division that is too thin? Surely we can think of something that is much greater, that would differentiate these. Where are we exactly? Let me remind myself. Between these non-interbreeding creatures. And I think about the fact that he said that if we divide improperly, then we'll get to our place a little bit slower. We should get there quicker. But on this present division, we're going to get there a bit slower. As I've mentioned before, these two philosophies, I don't think one is correct or one is incorrect. It's just the way of coming to understand something through that process of division. The visitor says, and what's more, the nature of the remaining class has in its turn the power of the diagonal of our power, if indeed it is endowed with 2 times 2 feet. So what does this mean? The nature of the remaining class has in its turn the power of the diagonal of our power. So here, I think, he is referring to the animal. So the remaining class, the class that would be outside of the human being, since he mentioned the human being, the class of the human beings, earlier, and he mentioned the power of 2 feet that the humans possess. The nature of the remaining class has in its turn the power of the diagonal of our power. The diagonal of our power is 2. So if we were to build a square upon 2 square, the diagonal then would be produced 4. So from this we can say either that there's a reduction from the animal to the human being, or there's an expansion from the human being to the animal. I think the earlier potential fits well, such that our diagonal is a bit odd. It's a bit in between the spiritual, between the divine and the temporal. Visitor says, and there's more. Do we see, Socrates, that there's something else resulting in our divisions that would tell itself have done well as a comic turn? Our human class has shared the field and run together with the noblest and also most easygoing class of existing things. Isn't it reasonable to expect the slowest or the sowest to come in last? Now here he's having fun. And don't we notice that the king looks even more ridiculous when he continues to run along with his herd and has traversed convergent paths with the man who for his part is best trained of all for the easygoing life? Okay, so there's a little bit that I think that we have to explore here. So he makes reference to the pig, the 4-legged creature, and then immediately turns around. There's this juxtaposition that is formed when we have the image of the pig. It's such a strange thing that man shares a space with these creatures as it is. But as we can imagine from the pig, as we can imagine their nature, we can imagine the human beings that have an easygoing nature, and we can imagine the responsibilities of a king who, by their very experience, by their responsibilities, they are not meant to be in that class of creature. And yet, by both being human, they intersect in such a way. And perhaps by this intersection, there's something bizarre. There's something that we wouldn't necessarily wish to see there, but there is. He says that such a method of argumentation as ours is not more concerned with what is more dignified than what is not, and neither does it at all despise, the smaller more than the greater, but always reaches the truest conclusion by itself. So we've come back full circle. Although we've made some progress in our divisions, we're taking a little bit of a reprieve, and we are saying that the heart is along for the journey, but it is not the thing that disturbs our reason, because by our method we follow where we must go, regardless of where it takes us. So it would seem that we are quite close now to something fairly significant, and we've reached our next 2 pages. So I'd like to read these. Young Socrates responds, "It seems so." The visitor says, "Well then, after this, so that you don't get in before me and ask what the shorter way is, the one we spoke of earlier, to the definition of the king, shall I go first and show you the way?" "Very much so." "Then I say that in this case one must immediately distribute what goes on foot by opposing the 2-footed to the 4-footed class. And when one sees that the human still sharing the field with the winged alone, one must go on to cut the 2-footed herd by means of the non-feathered and the feathered. And when that has been cut, and the expertise of human herding has then and there been brought into light, one must lift the expert statesmanship and kingship like a charioteer into it, and install him there, handing over his reins of the city as belonging to him, and because this expert knowledge is his." Young Socrates says, "That's well done, and you've paid me the account I asked for, as if I were a debt," adding the digression as a kind of interest, making up the sum. "Come on, then, let's go back to the beginning and gather together from there to the end of our account of the name of the expertise of the statesman." "Absolutely." "Well then, of theoretical knowledge, we had at the beginning a directive part, and of this, the section we wanted was by analogy said to be self-directing. Then again, rearing the living creatures, not the smallest herd rearing form, from rearing of living creatures, and from that, in turn, rearing of what goes on foot, and from that, as the relevant part, was cut off the expertise of rearing the hornless sort. Of this, in turn, the part must be woven together as not less than triple, if one wants to bring it together into a single name, calling it expert knowledge of rearing of non-interbreeding creatures. The segment from this, a part relating to a 2-footed flock, concerned with rearing human beings, still left on its own. This very part is now what we are looking for, what we were looking for. The same thing we call both kingly and statesmanlike." "Absolutely." "Is it really the case, Socrates, that we have actually done this, as you have just said?" "Done what?" "Given a completely adequate response to the matter we raised. Or is our searching lacking especially in just this respect, that our account of the matter has been stated in a certain way, but has not been finished off to complete perfection?" "How do you mean?" "I shall try now to show, for both of us, still more clearly just what I'm thinking of." "Please go ahead." "Well then, of the many sorts of expertise to do with rearing herds that appeared in our view just now, statesmanship was one. And was care of some one sort of herd?" "Yes." "And our account defined it not as rearing of horses or of other animals, but as knowledge of collective rearing of human beings?" "Just so." "Then let us look at the differences between all herdsmen, on the one hand, and the kings on the other." "What's that?" "Let us see if in the case of any other herdsman, anyone who has the title of another expertise claims or pretends to share the rearing of the herd with him." "How do you mean?" "Like this, that merchants, farmers, millers, and bakers, all of them, and gymnastic trainers too, and doctors as a class, all of these, as you well know, would loudly contend against the herdsmen concerned with things human, whom we called statesmen, that they care for human rearing, not merely for that of human beings in the herd, but for that of the rulers as well. Well, would they be right? Perhaps. That we'll consider. But what we know is that with a cow herd, no one will dispute about any of these things. But the herdsman is by himself rearer of the herd, by himself its doctor, by himself its matchmaker, as it were, and sole expert of the midwife's art when it comes to the births of offspring and confinements. Again, to the extent that the nature of his charges allows him to partake in play and music, no one else is more capable of comforting them and soothing them with his incantations, performing best, as he does, the music that belongs to his flock with instruments or with unaccompanied voice. And it's the same way with all other herdsmen, true? Quite right. So how will our account of the king appear to us right and complete when we posit him as sole herdsman and rearer of the human herd, singling him out on his own from among tens of thousands of others who dispute the title with him? There's no way in which it can. Then our fears a little earlier were right, when we suspected that we should prove, in fact, to be describing some kingly figure, but not yet accurately to have finished the statesman off, until we removed those who crowd round him, pretending to share his herding function with him, and having separated him from them, we reveal him on his own, uncontaminated with anyone else? Yes, absolutely right. Well then, Socrates, this is what we must do, if we are not going to bring disgrace upon our argument at its end. So those are the 2 pages. An interesting couple. Let's get into these. Now, of the visitor's first major statement, he gives a type of summation and a type of continued division. And there's a question that comes up in my mind. It seems, in some sense, hasty that we have gone down the path from those animals that are horned and non-horned to those that live on 2 feet versus 4, and then of those that are on 2 of the winged sort or the feathered sort and the non-feathered, and we've come down at once to the human. He says, and when it has been cut, and the expertise of human herding has then and there been brought into light, one must lift the expert in statesmanship and kingship like a charioteer into it and install him there, handing over the reins of the city as belonging to him, and because this expert knowledge is his. Now at this point, this is not a situation where we would not have expected us to be. This is something that we could have imagined even without going on that process of division. But it is not all for naught. For one, we are still going. And secondly, when we go back up that trace, the division tree, I think we had made some useful divisions, that we actually did follow a path to lead us somewhere. And so the visitor, he continues, he says, of theoretical knowledge, we had at the beginning a directive part, and of this, the section we wanted was by analogy said to be self-directing. Then again, rearing of living creatures, not the smallest of classes of self-directing knowledge, was split off from it. Then a herd-rearing form, from rearing of living creatures, and from that, in turn, rearing of what goes on foot, and from that, as the relevant part, was cut off the expertise of rearing the hornless sort, Of this in turn, the part must be woven together is not less than triple if one wants to bring it together into a class, into a single name, calling it expert knowledge of rearing of non-interbreeding creatures. The segment from this, a part of relating to a two-footed flock concerned with rearing of human beings, still left on its own. This very part is now what we were looking for. The same thing we call both kingly and statesmanlike. So it has taken us some time. It's taken me 3.5 hours to go through a fairly introductory division, getting down to something that has real substance to it. Even in these pages, the 2 pages that are before us, we're not really into strong philosophy. But I have to stay reminded that what we have experienced so far has been that understanding, the experience of that process of dividing, of moving down towards simplest or simpler and simpler parts. Simpler in a sense, but also more complex in a sense. Because when we get down to the principle of something, we understand it more deeply. And while at the higher levels we may have broader concepts, it does not mean that broader concepts are analogous to a high volume of information or a low volume of information. It is just the level itself that is of interest. And so I think it will do us well to keep this in mind as we move forward. The other thing that comes to mind is that a particular level, let's say the level of the horned versus the non-horned, or of the interbreeding and non-interbreeding, I think there's a lot that can be said here, perhaps. It would be a bit of a stretch. And I think a lot more can be said about the self-directive as it relates to the human experience. So in terms of relevance, the levels may contain a higher volume of information or a lower, but it is by their relationship to our particular ends, our particular goals, that it matters. Now, by my nature, I'm wanting for something that is more, for knowledge that I may be missing, that can be revealed through farther reflection. But setting this aside for the moment, and going back to that earlier concern that I had, when I said that coming down to this point, it seems like we've made a misstep, in a way. A misstep in the sense that, especially once we hit the division of animals, we lost our way. And that, starting from a place of knowledge and expertise, seemed to make fair sense, going down through the self-directive, and even of the animate and inanimate, because there we had some discussion about being and about soul, or at least the implication there was soul. But much like young Socrates, as he made the distinction between the human being and the animal, we've made the same sort of mistake, it would seem. That we are traveling by more layers than young Socrates to make the distinction between the human being from the animal. But we know, of course, that we're going to do this at some point. And surely there was a more expedient road to get there. And I think that the visitor, as he goes through this experience, he recognized this. Now, I may come back to adjust my words in a moment, but he says, "Is it really the case, Socrates, that we have actually done this, as you have just said. And young Socrates says, done what? Given a completely adequate response to the matter we raised? Or is our search lacking especially in just this respect, that our account of the matter has been stated in a certain way, but has not been finished off to complete perfection? And this feeling that I got, that I have been getting, throughout this whole reflection thus far, questioning the divisions, accepting it to a degree because we have to go through the experience to understand if it's actually going to be beneficial to us. I see this in my own career. I happen to be in a particular profession where the nature of it is just participating in it and adjusting as the experience goes along. And it's not necessarily a bad thing for a person to change course or change path. And so it seems that the path that we move into aligns us a little bit closer to what we're after in the following sense. So we identify that our primary objective is the statesman and the king, kingsmanship. More specifically, in a particular type of collective rearing, collective herding, the collective herding of human beings. And so he says, while it may be useful, I suppose, to run through that long-winded exercise of removing the human being as different from other creatures, we still find ourselves back into that territory among the whole class of human beings, and of the ways in which herding can be accomplished. There are forms where I might, in my mind, just say for a moment, collective leadership. That can be analogized to this collective herding of human beings. Can exist in forms that are more than just statesman-like or king-like. So he says, let us look at the difference between all herdsmen on the one hand and kings on the other. So a potential new division. For in this division, if we are going to separate the king out from the herdsman, before we were considering the king to be a collective herder of people, of that self-directed sort of knowledge that tends towards the animate. But again, it's still potential. It's not set in stone quite yet. He says, let us see if in the case of any other herdsman, anyone who has the title of another expertise claims or pretends to share the rearing of the herd with him. So here he's not denying the king is a herd rearer, let's say, a collective leader. But he is saying that the management of the herd can be quite multifaceted, much like our analogy of earlier, when we identified something that goes on foot. What we saw was this sort of fractured situation in which the disciples of otherness, of difference, spread themselves out and were met by the disciples of that which is, the principle of unification that gives thingness its nature, its essence, whatever. It is identity. And although that procedure that we went through in identifying the things that go on foot, useful for the image, had not really moved us closer to where we now seem to be approaching. A little bit closer now we think about the king and we think about potential herdsmen. But the image is much the same. such that we have this fractured landscape. And what begins to form, again based on the disciples of that which is, are the various identities of the herders that have some influence over the collective, that have some sway over the collective movement, perhaps the collective consciousness. And so now we get into something quite interesting. The visitor says, like this, that merchants, farmers, millers, and bakers, all of them, and gymnastic trainers too, and doctors as a class. So pausing there for a second. He's filling in these various identities that, in my mind, as an image, before, given this initial condition of thinking about not only just herdsmen that have a collective, that might have an influence on the collective and a leadership role in the collective, but also the individual items themselves, the individual identities, the people that participate to make up the collective, to make up the herd, that no doubt have relational influence. The herdsman, the statesman, the king, they all have relational influence. They all have overlapping responsibilities, I think, to a degree. Responsibilities to the herd. We have to put aside, just for the moment, because we'll get into this, I'm sure, rather shortly, the effectiveness or the virtuosity or the moral domain by which these affairs are conducted. But nonetheless, again, I want to highlight the importance that the visitor is filling in certain identities to give us a particular frame of reference, so that when he mentions the doctor, the farmer, the baker, all of these seemingly different classes of people, they are classes of people. They participate in the herd. They have this collective influence. He says, all of these, as well as you know, would loudly contend against the herdsmen concerned with things human, whom we called statesmen, that they, the statesmen, care for human rearing, not merely for that of human beings in the herd, but for that of rulers as well. And so, I believe what we are seeing here is a cultural perspective, that just as much as in our day, we have a negative connotation that's associated with the statesman. There is a positive one somewhere in there, but at the present period it is quite negative. And so thinking about this in a little bit more detail before we move on, because young Socrates is going to ask, well, would they be right? Would they be right to contend against the herdsman that is concerned with things, the herdsman concerned with things human, that they care for human rearing, that they care for human beings, that the rulers care for human beings, that the rulers care for human rearing? A conception against care. Now here I think it's important to note how important care is. If we are to think of the human mind as this creative engine that has that potential to establish what is valuable for itself, for the collective, it's quite a powerful tool. Certainly there will be many that attempt to manipulate, to suppress the authority of that productive spirit, to take it for their own, to use it as an excuse, maybe legitimate or not, to bind identities together in a stable collective. But a contention against those that are supposed to be in a role of caring for human affairs, would imply that culturally, or maybe absolutely, that the way in which the statesman or the king is constituted is not oriented towards the productive affairs of man and for the individual spirit. Not just the individual spirit, but the collective spirit as well. Because after all, we're talking about two things. He mentions individual identities, merchants, farmers, millers, bakers, gymnastic trainers, doctors, but also of the herd, of human beings. And of the most important thing that he had mentioned, of the multiplicity and of the singularity, he mentions care. He mentions the glue that unites the multiplicity, that differentiates the singular, that differentiates the ruler, that differentiates the collective, the herd, the human being in general. And it's frustrating, certainly from the part of the multiplicities, the people that make up the collective. If they are not represented, if they are not properly cared for, then their opinion of the statesman, their opinion of those that take it upon themselves to actually participate in this collective rearing, if these people do not appropriately care, then what we have is what? A misplaced identity. We have a misapportioned collective, a misguided society. There are plenty of things that we can hypothesize about what it would necessarily mean for care and the value that we place within it to be mishandled, because again, it is the glue that holds the collective together. But care is also the thing that appropriately differentiates between those uniting identities, the king, the statesman, etc. Now, I paused there for a second because I had a thought that I had not necessarily considered before. When we were going through the Sophist, we had this long conversation. It's one of the crown jewels of that dialogue, I think, is the discussion between being and non-being, between that which is and that which is not. And throughout the whole process, of course, the heart, as much as I can express myself, of human nature, I desire for this connection between the two. And it's not really until now, ironically enough, I believe in God. My conception of God changes as I mature and as I continue to pray and all this sort of thing. But as I reflect on it now, as I reflect on the question of how can God be both being and non-being, I think it is in this way. God is being and non-being united by that glue, by care or by love. I think that would be an equivalent term there. Love in and of itself is a large structure that we would have to spend some time thinking about and unpacking. So by extension, the visitor responds to young Socrates' question, well, would they be right? The visitor says, perhaps. That we'll consider. But what we know is that with a cowherd, no one will dispute about any of these things. But the herdsman is by himself rearer of the herd. By himself, its doctor. By himself, its matchmaker, as it were. And sole expert in the midwife's art when it comes to the births of offspring and confinements. Again, to the extent that the nature of his charges allows them to partake in play and music, no one else is more capable of comforting them and soothing them with his incantations, performing best, as he does, the music that belongs to his flock with instruments or with unaccompanied voice. And it's the same way with all other herdsmen. True? So I feel like we've been given another layer on top of this. This conversation that we were having, that is. So I want to take this line by line. So he begins by saying, what we know is that with a cowherd, no one will dispute about any of these things. So a particular type of herdsman, a cowherd, a person that herds cows. So there's a difference, obviously, between somebody that takes on that responsibility of herding the four-legged animal and of somebody that takes on the responsibility of herding a collective bunch of human beings. And the disposition, the attitude towards this, is not the same. Now, of course, we would have to ask why. Why are they so antagonistic to the sort that take on what seems to be a fairly respectable, difficult occupation? But the herdsman is by himself rearer of the herd. So here we have two different distinctions. The cowherd, and I think he can be classified as the herdsman, but also the herdsman that is leaning more towards the leader of the collective in the human sphere. The herdsman is by himself rearer of the herd. So we have emphasis on the singular identity. By himself, it's doctor. So not just the herdsman, but of particular class. That he takes on a sort of supreme knowledge, a supreme understanding of classes, of identities. And yet he is but one. By himself, it's matchmaker. What does it mean to be a matchmaker? We think of relationships here. We think of man and woman, bringing them together. A matchmaker between any number of identities. But in that matchmaking, he has to understand the ways in which they are matched together. We can speak about the necessity for his expertise to go deep enough to permeate all identities, but there has to be at least some understanding for him to manage all of these identities, matchmake them, to fix them in the case of the doctor, to direct them in the case of the cowherd, or in the pure herder sense. And the sole expert in the midwife's art when it comes to births of offspring and confinements. So again, another extension. The midwife being somebody that is an expert in bringing children from the womb. There's some rich symbolic layering I think that we can reflect on here. Because of course in the process of birth, in the human sphere, what is happening is an entirely new experience is being generated. Potential for quite a lot, for the mind to develop and to undergo that creative excitement, the creative gift that has provided that thing, that creature. And it is not that the midwife alone shares in this. even though she is the one that is producing this identity. She is responsible in this way. The statesman, or the herdsman in this case, sort of rests above her. He is a bit of a parasite in the way that he occupies the space of her expertise. He analyzes it. He claims to know it. But of course she knows it better than he. And so there is a discord certainly there. For how can one direct in a case of such ignorance and not knowing? I think there's a certain part about identity that one cannot just sort of conceptualize or rationalize. It has to be participated in. That's why we have experts. And that an expert is not somebody that just sits by and passively thinks about things, but again, actively solves problems, has experience in time of solving problems. Again, he continues, to the extent that the nature of his charges allows them to partake in play and music. So let's pause there for a second. To the extent that the nature of his charges allows them to partake. The nature of his charges. So this could be his responsibility. Now I just want to mention that I'm going to take a break for today, and I'll return to this tomorrow, so it might take me a little bit to get caught up to where I was. But until then. So as I've mentioned, a day has passed. A new day, fresh thoughts, hopefully good thoughts. It is at the end of a work day, and I am excited to get back into this now. So I did a little bit of thinking before I pressed record. And I'd like to slowly get back into this headspace that I was in yesterday. Keeping in mind that we're speaking about the herdsman in the context of the previous bit of dialogue in which the visitor raises that proposal, the image. He says, all of these, as you well know, would loudly contend against the herdsman concerned with things human, whom we called statesmen, that they care for human rearing, not merely for that of human beings in the herd, but for that of the rulers as well. So there's this slight, or maybe not slight at all, overt idea that there may be a potential disagreement culturally between the various identities or classes of people and the people that are stationed above them in the leadership, from a leadership standpoint. And so now, based on young Socrates' question, would they be right? The visitor is now tasked to think about this. Now, I know that yesterday we went into this bit of dialogue, but just for the sake of comprehensiveness, perhaps that we'll consider. But what we know is that with a cowherd, no one will dispute about any of these things. But the herdsman is by himself rearer of the herd. By himself its doctor. By himself its matchmaker, as it were, and sole expert in the midwife's art, when it comes to the births of offspring and confinements. So, there's a path that I went down yesterday. The path was clothed in the context of the previous bit of dialogue, that there is this air of antagonism that goes with the potential view of these classes of people. There's another way in which we can interpret this, in which the visitor is now making a case for the herdsman or the statesman, a case for him in the way that he ought to be. And I don't necessarily think that either of these interpretations is incorrect per se. We can follow both paths. Again, he says, but what we know is that with a cowherd no one will dispute about any of these things. But the herdsman is by himself a rearer of the herd. By himself its doctor. A man that occupies many classes, responsible for many things. He says again, to the extent that the nature of his charges being those cared for, nourished, pastured, in other words, the herd under the shepherd's care, which is the statesman as the herdsman. He's responsible for his flock or the citizens. Their nature meaning the inherent capacities, dispositions, and limits that belong to the citizens as beings. Now, the nature of his charges, the identification of his charges, in one sense we think about it in terms of his responsibility. In another sense, we are prompted to consider the citizenry. So if we go into that a little bit farther, when we examine his responsibility, we think about his responsibility for nourishing and caring. We also have to consider about those that are cared for. And when we consider those that are cared for, we consider their nature, we consider their capacity and their limits. To the extent that the nature of his charges allows them to partake in play and music, no one else is more capable of comforting them and soothing them with his incantations. Now again, this can go both ways. Incantation in the sense of the wizardry, the sorcery, that's more in the sophist's territory. It is the man that understands the fractal nature of things, the way in which that which is and that which is not participates together, but hides in the fog. He uses the incantation in a way that submits, where otherwise, if they were aware, that fog that obstructs the vision was no longer present, then they would maybe not otherwise submit to such a type of rule, let's say. As he does, the visitor continues, the music that belongs to his flock, with instruments or with unaccompanied voice. And it's the same way with all other herdsmen. So when we expand this out to all other herdsmen, I get an idea that is not as much about the negative, about the contrary. If we think about the cowherd, the sheep herder, whatever the situation is, these people do so not for power. They may do so for money, for wealth, but eventually there has to be some true caring that's involved there. The true nature of their responsibility has to be met. Otherwise, they cannot occupy that position. For long, anyway. The statesman, the herder, can only administer care in proportion to the receiving nature of those he tends. He provides that primary logos. but their effect is bound by that reciprocal opening, the receptivity of the flock. Now, young Socrates says, quite right. And the visitor continues, so how will our account of the king appear to us right and complete, when we posit him as sole herdsman and rearer of the human herd, singling him out on his own from among tens of thousands of others who dispute the title with him? Young Socrates says there's no way in which it can. So let's expand this image a little bit. What does it mean singling him out on his own from among tens of thousands of others who dispute the title with him? Does he mean this literally? Like there are tens of thousands that are at the gates that would take the position of kingship? Or is the dispute more of a natural occurrence, such that, given the king's vast responsibilities, and given that he has not the specific technical concerns of the classes that he governs, but rather more of a holistic, intuitive sense of governance, that by his grand powers, he runs into these natural limits, and it's because of the natural limits of his lack of knowledge and perhaps his desire to impose something that cannot be, or impose something such that the participation of the various classes is in some way disrupted, and thereby diminishing the prosperity of the flock. The visitor says, then our fears a little earlier were right, when we suspected that we should prove in fact to be describing some kingly figure, but not yet accurately to have finished the statesman off until we remove those who crowd around him, pretending to share his herding function with him, and having separated him from them, we reveal him on his own, uncontaminated with anyone else. This is what we must do if we are not going to bring disgrace on our argument at its end. So as we bring this episode to a close, I'd like to reflect on a few things a little bit farther. I think there are two main things that we need to focus on at this point. The first that comes to mind is the nature of the herdsman. We've discussed the nature of the herdsman a little bit, and some of it has been a little bit easier than some of the other things to understand. But in general, despite how the various classes in society may view culturally the herdsman, and by extension the statesman is responsible for governing by the nature of his citizens or subjects. It is by that reciprocal relationship that affordances are made. It is by that, we speak a lot about the self, the subject, and the ways in which the self can be brought to understand the ways in which they can utilize their potential, the ways in which they share in the divine experience, and that is for the productive engine, for the creative engine. But they are not the supreme divinity, and they cannot reduce themselves to that conceited sphere. Otherwise, they necessarily blind themselves. In the same way, in a fractal way, the statesman or the herdsman, if he is unable to accurately identify the nature of his citizens, effectively in such a way that he promotes their growth, through his art, play, music, to harmonize them, as it is referred to, but rather subjects them through some despotic, conceited desire, then what happens is an implosion. It's an ischemic response. It is a lack of the nourishing life that is brought to the human mind, that understands meaning and produces things that are meaningful. And it is not the statesman's role to mess in the particulars, in the technical aspects of the merchants, of the farmers, of the millers, of the bakers, but rather to facilitate, again, the growth of these classes. Now, the second thing is when we come to the king, because, as we have just spoken of a moment ago, we are still not quite in the space where we have differentiated the king from the statesman, which appear, based on the visitor's dialogue, that these are two separate classes. Again, he says, "How will our account of the king appear to us right and complete when we posit him as sole herdsman and rearer of the human herd, singling him out on his own among tens of thousands of others who dispute the title with him?" And of course, we broke this down into two potential parts. The disputed title, in a literal sense, that there are 10,000 people who think that they may be able to occupy this position, and then the way in which the way in which the king is ruling has subjected the framework, the interrelated network of all the individual classes or identities, in such a way that becomes, much like we discussed with the statesman, despotic. But here we see how there's this lack of division between the herdsman, or the statesman, and the king. We suspected, says the visitor, that we should prove in fact to be describing some kingly figure, but not yet accurately to have finished the statesman off, until we remove those who crowd around him, pretending to share his herding function with him, and having separated him from them, we reveal him on his own, uncontaminated with anyone else. So it's a little bit difficult to imagine how we might start to differentiate this. But this is where I'm going to end this episode. So until next time.